Alright, YouTube, there's still confusion about what religion is Styx Hexenhammer, what path does he follow, what gods does he have. So let me make it plain for people who, they see like, a half-decade-old video on Satanism that I did, and they think that I'm still a Satanist or an atheist or something like that. I am not an atheist, I'm an apatheist. I'm also not a Satanist, I'm a pagan. What that means is, essentially, I don't care if there are deities. It doesn't bother me if there are, it doesn't bother me if there aren't. I don't see it as an important issue. As far as religion goes, generally speaking, I'm irreligious. That is, I don't go to a church, I don't go to a mosque or synagogue or a pagan temple, I don't do sacrifices on an altar or anything like that. It's an unimportant part of my spiritual practice. As far as spirituality goes, I am spiritual. I believe in the occult, I believe in magic, I believe in all sorts of mythology and things of that nature. I'm sort of half believing of the ancient aliens hypothesis. I think that there's some credence to that general ethos. I think that that general set of beliefs that we were made by or visited in the past by aliens and began worshiping them in some way makes sense to me. It makes more sense than the idea of an invisible, preeminent man in the sky creating everything. That being said, though, as far as organized religion goes, I hold it in contempt. I believe that organized religion is probably the greatest force of evil in the world today. You think about it this way. In order to convince people to make them your leader in a political sense, you have to make promises to them, you have to manipulate them, you have to use propaganda on them. Otherwise, they would never accept that, including within a representative system, assuming that the things you were proposing were anything other than, hey, we'll collect an extremely small tax for basic infrastructure and maintain a military. That's basically all we're going to do. Anything beyond that, essentially speaking, is superfluous, assuming that the population is sufficiently well educated to take care of itself in most other measures. But within religion, all you have to do is convince them that there's a boogeyman who's going to punish them eternally if they don't join your cult. And that's why I think organized religion, arguably, is far worse than politics, far worse than any government. Governments around the world throughout time, especially communist governments, they're the worst, have killed untold tens of millions of people. Communists especially, but any authoritarian ideology. The more authoritarian it is, the more deaths tend to occur. It doesn't matter whether it's fascism, communism, whatever it happens to be. A police state, you can see, grinds down the population over time, stifles innovation, leads to a lot of death and suffering. It's inefficient, it tends to grow over time and get worse and worse. It metastasizes like a cancer. Organized religion, though, doesn't have to physically involve itself in violence. It simply encourages violence. And in that way, perhaps it's even worse. It's not a compulsion, it's a suggestion. And it's a very dishonest one. When a Christian priest or bishop or whatever, or pastor, condemns a group of people, there is always the risk that violence will break out. We see this happening mostly in the third world. If you look at Christian Africa, you will see that there are still witch burnings happening there. There are mentally ill children are left to die. Women who, an old woman with cerebral palsy gets stoned as though she were a witch because somebody's cow stopped giving milk. It's very medieval. It's literally like being 500 or 600 years ago. We would look at the more zealous parts of the Islamic world, similar things happen. You have strange rituals that lead to direct psychological or physical harm that are accepted there. And they weren't put there as any part of a government mandate. In some cases, the two overlap seamlessly, and you have a theocracy. You'd think of Saudi Arabia, or Iran, or some of these nations. And aren't they, indeed, if you look at them, don't they seem to be, in many cases, the most despotic? This can also be the case in a hard atheist regime. We'd look at North Korea, where the majority of the population doesn't really have what you would consider organized religious beliefs, even in the absence. The fact that there is a dictate of essentially state atheism has taken the place of the same. This happened under Maoist China, Mao's rule. Stalinism certainly was basically the same. The orthodoxy was at most tolerated in some cases, and otherwise generally relegated to the backseat, condemned, made political, and subjugated. Organized religion, in almost all of these cases, has played some sort of role, including the organization of an absence of religion, the compulsion of irreligion. I am irreligious. but I wouldn't want to belong to a state that dictated that one had to be irreligious in order to be left alone and tolerated by the state, because bad times would be ahead. What about spirituality? What about the occult? Would that fall under the umbrella of something that atheistic regime would ban? Maybe, maybe not. It depends. You'd have to literally go before some, judge or something, or get sent to the gulag, where you'd have to explain to the guards, well, I practice magic, but I don't have any gods, and I don't go to a church or anything, and hopefully you wouldn't have to bribe them too much to let you go, or something like that, like what would happen under Stalinism. Oh yeah, I'm Orthodox, just here's 20 rubles, don't tell anybody, leave me and my family alone. Here's a sack of potatoes too that we managed to salvage from the famine that we just went through, or something like that. Organized religion is best summed up when you look at the soaring towers of a cathedral or one of these mega mosques or something, and you think about how much labor and expenditure was required to build them, and then you look at the population of these same religions over the world and you see how impoverished sometimes they tend to be. You can see the interplay there, and it must look a little bit hypocritical. You don't need to be a hardline atheist or an anti-theist to understand this. You can be apatheistic, not care about the theism issue, irreligious but not strictly anti-religious as I am. I happen to oppose organized religion, specifically because it lends itself to corruption. As far as religion in the sense of, somebody believes in the Bible, worships Jesus, I don't care. Believes in the Quran, worships Allah, again, I don't care. But when they become part of an organized body, it tends to politicize itself anyway, innately. It forms a sort of sub-politic culture as well, and that's really one of the other problems and excesses of organized religion. I would point out, if there actually is a being up in the sky somewhere who is limitless, inexhaustible, all-permeating, and all-knowing, does this being make sense if it cares if you build a cathedral or a minaret or something like that? These structures that have been built by man over time for worshipful purposes. To man, they seem imposing. The soaring arches of a Gothic cathedral, or the Sophia over there in Turkey or something like that, Hagia Sophia. They must seem very imposing. Gigantic, the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount or something like that. But to a being which is so many more magnitudes larger in its scope and its power, these would be nothing more than little... they'd be unremarkable. They wouldn't even really be noticed because they wouldn't mean anything. If such a being actually cared whether people believed in it or not, I would say that being has an ego problem. I would say that being is rather unenlightened, perhaps doesn't deserve to be worshipped. I look to paganism, and I see pantheism, and I see that people believe in perhaps more fallible, humanesque, anthropic styles of gods. I say those are a little bit better than the whole singular, all-powerful, all-knowing beings. Because they're more believable, there would be a reason why evil would exist. Some of these beings represent aspects that we would generally term as negative. For instance, children dying of measles or people getting raped or something. You'd have actual deities that sort of lord over and encourage such things at a constant struggle with the deities representing perhaps nobility, protecting the poor, or something like that. And so it would make sense. That pantheon at least is sensible from a human perspective. But to posit a being that is literally all-encompassing doesn't make sense. This being, if all-encompassing, literally all-present, would be in your turds, quite literally. It would exist there. It would also be within you, and therefore why would you even need to worship it in an externalized manner? And what purpose would a church serve if that being is everywhere? Could you not do the same thing just on your lawn or in your living room or something like that? The Christians have, for instance, the idea you should pray at night before you go to bed or something. Oh, Lord, forgive us of our sins, blah, blah, say the Lord's Prayer. Well, why can't you just say the whole Mass in your home? Why do you need a dedicated church that you've, spent money on as a community to actually worship in? It makes no difference. It's not sensible. This being if properly composed, probably wouldn't care about your efforts, because your efforts would be completely futile, mortal, denigrated, and so forth. If a being existed for the whole span of billions of years, the most well-built structure that you can create would last a few thousand, if properly maintained. And if you abandon it, maybe a few centuries if it's really well built. And that's basically the extent of what you can do. This being would look at that as a drop in the bucket in terms of time. Only a humanistic pantheon, like the Greek pantheon or something like that, really would make sense from that perspective. It's fallible. The beings are not unlimited. Collectively, maybe they represent everything. You've got the corn god and the sorghum god, and you've got the love god and the hate god and the death god and the birth god and stuff like that. Represents all possibilities, but they're partitioned from one another. That's why I look at Hinduism, I say, in a way, that's sort of the stopgap. You've got one primordial sort of cosmic Brahma, and at the same time, all of these other expressions stem from it through pure will. I say, therefore, technically speaking, it's a pantheistic path, but it's also a monotheistic path. I find Hinduism, by the way, interesting for this reason. That's why I'm more interested in it than perhaps Buddhism or some of these other Eastern forms, or Taoism or something like that. But no, organized religion, if you look at the fruits of its labor, most of it is misery and warfare. Now, if you worship a war god or something like that, yeah, that's just fine. No problem, because you believe that that's a virtue in some way or form. You believe in struggle, you believe in purification through fire, or some of these buzz terms that have been thought up by different Judeo-Christian sects, among others. That would be fine. There's nothing wrong with that, I suppose, from an objective moral standpoint. I look at it as subjective, so I would say, well, if you want to worship the god that tells you to kill people, at least be honest about the fact that that's what it's commanding. For instance, Christians and Muslims, they look at their scriptures, they say, no, we represent peace, we represent like loving your neighbor and stuff like that. But if you look at the actual scriptures, it doesn't look like that. It looks like these beings that they worship under various titles primarily command their followers, their flock, to butcher and slaughter and mutilate people and burn cities to the ground. It's what the Old Testament does within Judeo-Christianity. Certainly the Jews still worship such a being. They don't believe in the New Testament. You look at Islam, you look at some of the passages within the Quran, the same thing is happening. They're really more exaggerated historical documentation of genocide than they are anything to do with divinity. They simply happen to mention a divine force that guides the killing hands of some of these various people, Jesus Christ, or Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Moses, or Muhammad, or somebody like that. And that's essentially what organized religion really is. There are certain organized religions that shun these notions. From a moral standpoint, again, subjectively, okay, well, that's what you believe in. Objectively, how can you even say that that's true? Maybe you're supposed to kill people. Maybe you're supposed to be a warmonger. Maybe conquest is great and it's like the Greek times or something like that. And the gods smile upon the blood sacrifice as you butcher your enemies out of your way and take their land and their women and their crops. Who knows? Maybe not the best world for most people to live in, but again, you can't really make, objectively speaking, you can't make that determination because you don't know. I would state, as a last point here, I consider hard atheism to be a religion. Not soft atheism, simply saying, well, I don't believe in a God. That's not a religious or spiritual statement. It's more of an agnostic atheism. But if you claim to know, you're making the same positive claim that a Christian would make. Well, I know that God is real. You're simply saying, I know God is not real, or this specific God is not real. That claim is itself a claim. It's not simply a negation of a claim already made. It's a new claim that you happen to be making. And I would say in that sense, state atheism and hard atheism as a quasi-organized movement at least, really is equivalent in many ways to some of these organized religions like the Catholic body or Shia Islam or something like that. No, I hold it all in contempt because it stifles people's creativity, tells them not to be individuals, tells them what's true and what's not, rather than letting them logically work it out themselves, tells them to worship various beings who, quite often, appear to be total shitfucks, honestly. If you look at most of these divine scriptures, that's essentially what you'll find. That's about all. Peace out.